shout out to the lightnetwork.tv and the guys and girls over there who have been a huge blessing to us. And if you have not gone over to the lightnetwork.tv to check out their website, to check out the family of podcasts that are there, then we invite you to do so and make sure that you look at what else is available. And of course, if you want to subscribe to their email list, that would be the best way to do it when it comes to you receiving updates on the newest release of podcasts, because they were having some problems on Facebook. I don't know how many people know that. And so they actually had to get people to subscribe to their email list. It was Facebook doing it to them.
I know.
It wasn't the Light Network's problem. It was Facebook's problem.
Facebook, yes, it was their problem.
So.
Okay. And we did try and come to you live from Cancun this past week. It was going to be so great. Live in front of the ocean with the breeze and the bluest waters you've ever seen. And Joe... And
didn't come through for you, basically.
Technical difficulties.
You know what was interesting about Cancun? And of course, it's been a while since we've been on in a live show format. So it's not like it was Cancun. It was the week before that. I also had an illness that I could not help. And I joined a club that I did not want to be a part of. And of course, that was mentioned on Facebook. But by the time we got that taken care of, then we went to Cancun. And the thought was, well, we'll record live from Cancun. The problem is in Cancun, when I tried to record from my cell phone, it was hit or miss in what we could do from a technology standpoint. And so I never had the opportunity to record, even though I tried multiple times. And so if you're looking at this tonight, or you're going to watch this episode and you're going to say, Joe, we've been looking for the Hey Joe show for the last few weeks. Well, that's where we've been. It's not that we didn't try, and it wasn't that we planned for it. It was that the illness and the injury that came about.
It was just a little minor bump in the road. We're back, all is well. Remember, this season is going to be... Wait a minute. What did I label this season?
Who knows?
Wait a minute. Hang on. See, it's been a month.
What did
I
you
can't
label
remember what
this
I
season?
did yesterday. I know. Remember, it was in the first season. I said last season was something, and this season was the opposite of it.
This season is something, too.
But
Let me
this
tell you.
season's the opposite. It's like better, more on the positive side. I just can't remember. I can't remember what I had for lunch yesterday.
You know, I could probably tell you, but it wouldn't be of any benefit to anybody for me to do that. So I'm going to decide not to.
And that's not the point.
No, I'm teasing. Anyhow, we do obviously want to thank you for tuning in. And we're not here to talk about Cancun, and we're not here to talk about...
Although it was amazing.
My issues and Aaron's issues and all of our issues that are
issues.
there.
Just you have issues, Joe.
But we do want to make sure you understand that this season is about listener-driven topics. That's what we're dealing with this particular season. And so as we do such, and I'm going back here in my records to get back, try to the actual show where we received so much feedback, and to kind of give you the rundown of where we're going with this episode, because it does come straight from one of our viewers. And let me see here. I believe the viewer was Vicky, and Vicky posted, how about a subject that deals with respect for parents' boundaries and God's boundaries when selfish desires and peer pressure comes into the picture? She said, I'm not talking about sexuality, or I'm not talking sexual. I mean just authority in general. And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to cover the basis of helping young people when it comes to the subject of dealing with boundaries. And so, Aaron, I want to start off right off the bat, I guess you could say. And as you and I talk about this, let me ask you this. When your parents were raising you, did they set a lot of boundaries and a lot of restrictions upon you, or were they kind of loose, or did you not need a lot of boundaries?
Well, let me just say, I was pretty near perfect, so I didn't. No, I'm just kidding.
Nice.
Well, you just have to be honest.
I mean, just lay it out there the way it is.
No, I definitely think that I was raised in a family that boundaries were expected. But I will say, and I think I've said this on the show before, it's not that I was perfect. I was afraid of getting in trouble. So I was not going to push any boundaries that were established so that I would not get in trouble, other than running my mouth too much.
Gotcha.
Other than that,
so they set boundaries, though. That's the deal. They did set boundaries for you.
Yes.
Yeah, and mine did.
But in our family, I mean, at least as far as it concerned me, I mean, honestly, we were raised with certain values where a lot of things were unspoken boundaries. Like, I just knew better because I knew that those boundaries existed without always having to be clearly stated. It was just known.
So you were probably one of these children, these teenagers, these childrens that wanted to stay out of trouble. And so for you, it wasn't about how close can I get to the boundary, and it wasn't even about was the boundary there. It was the idea of I want to stay as far away from getting in trouble as I possibly can. Is that correct?
That is correct. 10 points, Joe. 10 points.
Well, and that's okay because not every child is that way. Not every kid's that way. Not every individual's that way. And so sometimes for those individuals, boundaries are there as a blessing. And sometimes we don't think about boundaries as a blessing. Is that me? Am I getting feedback?
No, that's me. I fixed it.
Okay. Sometimes we don't think about boundaries as a blessing. And so as we talk about this tonight, we need to understand something first and foremost is that your parents, if you're a teenager listening to this, or if you're a parent listening to this, excuse me while I kill my aunt, not my aunt, but my aunt. As you listen to this, I need you to start off by understanding, be it if you're a teenager or if you're a parent, then you need to understand something, that boundaries and the concepts of boundaries did not initiate with grumpy parents. I mean, I don't know how else to say that. Sometimes parenting styles, we almost make up for the things that we didn't like within our own parents. And so if our parents were extra strict, then maybe the tendency is to swing the pendulum to the other side and to be extra loose. And if our parents were extra loose and we wish that our parents were more strict on us, then it might be that we would turn to that side as well. And so we've got to understand something, that in our parenting styles, we've got to be cautious not to be on the other side of the pendulum just for the sake of the things that we didn't like about our own parents. Now, the reality is, Mom, if you're listening to this, Dad, if you're listening to this, I loved everything about your parenting style. Okay? I can't answer for my in-laws. Only Aaron can answer for my in-laws.
The Hey Joe show is supposed to be an honest show.
Oh, it is an honest show. I love my parents, and my mom will hear what you just said. But
I'm not talking about your mom, but you have a dad too.
Good one. But the idea is this: as we reflect upon our upbringing, chances are we're going to run into situations where we would say, "Oh, if I had children, I would do this. If I had children, I would do that," right?
Normal.
And so from a parenting standpoint, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we do not assume that boundaries and the concept of boundaries are evil, or that they should be a pendulum swing because the parents that we had may have been loose. Number one. Also, number one, if there's a teenager who's going to watch this show or a youth group who will be listening in, then we need to understand this as well, that boundaries did not originate with your parents. Sometimes we forget that if God initiated it, then I'm good with it. But if my parents just came up with it, then it's questionable. Here's the reality. God came up with boundaries. The Bible will say in Job chapter 38 and verses 4 through 5 that he set the boundaries of the land. In Job chapter 38 verses 8 through 11, the Bible says that he set the boundaries of the sea. In Job chapter 38 and verse 12, he set the boundaries of the dawn. In Job 38, 31 through 33, the boundaries of heavens. As a matter of fact, Aaron, when we go back and we look in the book of Genesis, if I'm not mistaken, that first couple, did God not set boundaries with them as well? Absolutely, he did. There you go. You can see that we are live. Didn't God set boundaries with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden?
He absolutely did.
Absolutely, he did.
Yes.
Now, here's the deal. If boundaries are inherently bad, then we have a God who did something inherently bad. The reality is boundaries aren't bad.
They're not bad.
Boundaries are there for our benefit. And until we realize that, until we swallow that and accept that, we're going to continue to have these issues. Now, whether or not I'll be able to get that up or not, I don't know.
And as you said, issues, there was another technical
tech issues there. So here's the hard part. As we look at the setting up of boundaries, we must accept the fact that God is a God of boundaries. He allowed the Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to eat of any tree of the garden that they desired, except for the one that was in the middle. And as long as they respected that boundary, then the relationship with God was going to be okay. If they did not respect that boundary, then it was not going to be okay. But we can't look at that and say, well, boundaries are bad. Boundaries are mean. Boundaries are healthy. You think about boundaries, and one of the greatest illustrations that I've heard in dealing with boundaries was the concept of guardrails. You see guardrails. We all see guardrails everywhere that we drive, right? And those guardrails are set up. Notice where the guardrails are set up. Guardrails are not set up in the zone where if an individual goes that direction that they will die. Guardrails are set up in the direction that if they hit the guardrail, that the car may get dinged up, but the person inside the car is most likely not going to die.
You mean it's not like bumper cars?
No, it's not supposed to be bumper cars. Right. It's not supposed to be bumper cars, but the deal is this, that those boundaries are there to protect. The boundaries are there to save from getting into the bad side, right? Getting into the dangerous side. So when we think about that, I want you to consider that God is the originator of boundaries, but I also want you to consider that those boundaries are there to protect us from the danger zone that we may or may not encounter, right?
Right.
All right. Colton, are we good? All right. I got to make sure that as we move forward in our production, that we are good to go.
No, that we have a production manager.
That's right.
Production manager, go make sure all other people are off the internet because I'm having trouble with my connection.
All right.
He's already on top of it.
Nah, he's on top of the internet issue. Now, here's the question that I'd like for us to ask tonight, though. When you start talking about helping young people respect the boundaries of their parents and so on and so forth, why is it, do you think, that young people have difficulty respecting boundaries? Do you think, and I don't want to ask a leading question, but do you believe that young people are, just born with this desire to rebel? Do you think that is? And of course, you got to be careful how you answer that one. But why do you think it is that young people struggle with honoring the boundaries of the authority figures, Aaron?
I'm sorry. I'm reading our comments, and somebody said that it may just be them, but they're getting choppy reception. So if you are getting choppy reception, please let us know.
Yeah.
We'll see if it's just you, Ruben, or if other people are as well. I know I'm having trouble from my end, but that would be odd if everybody was. Yeah,
and understand we only have so much internet bandwidth speed in the house, and so if a lot of it's being used, then there goes the Hey Joe Show bandwidth.
In the studio.
That's right. Excuse me, in our studio. That's right. So back to my question. Why is it do you think that young people struggle with boundaries?
I think that young people, that's a loaded question. There is a lot of answers to that. By the way, let's put a pin on that for just a second. I would like to hear some of the viewers, listeners, go ahead and pipe in why you think. I would love to hear what you have to say. I'm going to say part of the reason is because we are raised in a culture where there's a lot of me taught in society. So a lot of people have like more of a selfish attitude. And so because of the selfish attitude and it always having to feel like it's what I want, it's what I need, it's me, if someone infringes a boundary on that attitude of I should be able to have, do, say what I feel, what I want, then it makes us feel restricted. And I believe that is one reason why people do not like boundaries.
Because they feel restricted.
They feel restricted. That was a long way of going around and saying that.
And I think you're right on that, but oftentimes the restricted concept makes us feel like we're not worthy. And when young people struggle with the boundaries that their parents have set or the boundaries of the authority figures, sometimes it's because young people are already insecure about what's going on with them. And so when a parent sets a boundary, it makes the teenager, especially the teenager, feel like they're not adequate. Now, here's the truth of the matter, though. That's not the core of why the boundary was set. Although, when young people are honest with themselves, they have to realize that they are not fully mature yet. And so those boundaries are there to keep you within the confines of the road. That's what those boundaries are there for.
Right. And we have a couple comments as well. It says, do they struggle with boundaries or are they testing them to make sure they're still there? Which I think it could probably be both, actually.
Well, and you're right. It can be both. But what's funny is, and those who comment on this and those who make references, I'm hesitant to say psychologists and counselors, but some individuals have said that the reason young people challenge boundaries, the reason they go to the guardrails is because they want to know if the guardrail is going to stay there. That when parents, they continually have a bombardment and an attack on their boundaries or their rules, oftentimes parents will respond in one of two ways. Either they will get aggressively more strict, or what they will do is they will they will loosen up because the boundary moves. Well, believe it or not, it's my understanding that counselors have said that when the boundaries are hit by the children, by the teenagers, that if those boundaries remain consistent, that it actually brings stability to the life of that kid. That kids need to know that the boundaries are there. They need to know that they're stable and that they're not going anywhere, because oftentimes, I guess I would look at it this way. If I know the rules of the game, then I can play within the game. But if the rules of the game continually shuffle and I don't know if they're going to remain consistent, then I'm frustrated.
Right. Well, his follow-up comment actually was, and if we let go of those boundaries, they feel less secure and need to lash out until they find them again.
That is exactly right. And so the boundaries are there for multiple reasons. It's not just because you don't want your child to play in the road. A boundary for a teenager, it's not there just because you want them home by 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock. They're not there just because you're looking for a reason to have rules. The boundaries are there, believe it or not, because they actually add stability in the life of a child who, as they go through these teen years, they oftentimes will lack stability, but it's only because of their emotions and the uncertainty of themselves. And that's why the importance of the home and the boundaries that are set within the home are so vital to their maturity and to their psychology. So do you have another comment? You mentioned a comment from one of the listeners.
Yeah, I think that those were the two comments on that subject so far, other than some other people also getting choppy reception, which I'm not altogether sure why we're having that tonight, other than we seem to have tech issues.
We seem to have issues where kids are on the TV is probably what we have.
Yes, Colton, please go make sure that's taken care of. Also, I like this comment. It's kind of slightly veering off subject, but Pete says, "Hey, Joe." We love Pete.
Is that Pete?
We're so glad he's watching. Hey, Pete.
Like my friend.
Like your friend Pete.
Oh, I love Pete. Pete is awesome. But all right, so
back to boundaries.
Back to boundaries. And of course, Vicky's statement was, how about respect for parents' boundaries and God's boundaries when selfish desires and peer pressure comes into the picture? So one of the things we talked about are the importance of boundaries. We've talked about kind of why they're there and maybe why kids bounce off of them and teenagers try to go after them. But what about this? What if we're talking to teenagers and it's an issue of understanding that boundaries are there and that we have a choice whether or not to stay within them? I mean, because after all, parents set curfews, but whether or not kids abide by those curfews are up to the kids. Now, we could talk all day long about parents make sure the punishment is there if your boundaries are not respected, because at the end of the day, your boundaries add stability, which add health, and you're trying to teach them to respect God's boundaries. And so if they don't respect your boundaries, why would they respect God's boundaries, right?
Right.
And so there's a bigger picture from a parenting standpoint. But the question is geared more to this. How do you help a young person, not just with parental boundaries, but God's boundaries, when they have to battle selfish desires? Because there's that pull, right? And I'm not talking about swimming pool. I'm talking about a pull like a tug on a rope, right? And that deal is this. We all live in the flesh. We all have a desire to appease the flesh. I mean, that's a very core principle within the Bible, that we've got to choose to deny the flesh. We've got to choose to walk by the Spirit, not walk according to the flesh. We've got to choose to put off the old things, to put on the new things. We've got to choose to set our mind on things that are above and not things that are on this earth. And so with all those choices, Aaron, how do you handle that? I mean, the idea of a desire to step outside of the bounds of God. Of course, from what I've just heard you say is you've not really ever struggled with much of that.
You make me sound like I said I was perfect.
You're perfect. In my eyes, you are, baby.
No, I mean, honestly, I don't know. I really don't know what to say other than I was always afraid of getting into trouble. Like, I always was afraid of not wanting to disappoint or do the wrong thing. And so, not that I ever didn't disappoint or do the wrong thing, but my experience is very limited to me not wanting to get in trouble. I'm not the person to ask on this one.
Because there was never a sense to bounce off of.
I'm just your sidekick sitting here without good answers.
No, you're not. No, you're not. You're very valuable.
We need more feedback.
Well, I would love to hear from those who are watching and those
Hopefully
who
they're messaging.
Would message us on Facebook Live.
I may just not be seeing them.
But the idea is that when you and we think about the selfish desires that come about, I'm reminded of individuals like King Saul, who offered an unauthorized sacrifice in 1 Samuel chapter 13, I believe it was. I'm reminded of King David, who stepped outside of God's boundary with Bathsheba. I'm reminded of the children of Israel at the base of Mount Sinai, who, when Moses went up on the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments from God, that they are at the base of the mountain, and they told Aaron that they wanted to create a God for them. We have biblical precedent where individuals stepped outside of the boundaries of God. But in all of that, it's because they were looking for something that they felt the boundaries of God would not fulfill. And I believe that. In other words, Saul went outside the boundaries of God and offered the sacrifice on his own because he really believed that that was necessary to advance his purpose. David, we're given no indication that he withheld himself from the fleshly desires, but he wanted to appease that within him. He could have had any woman lawfully that was not a man's wife. He was a king. He could have married another woman. And he would, as the king, he would have had beautiful, women that were beautiful. So in that moment, he stepped outside of God's bounds because he felt that it was the thing to do to appease his fleshly desire. And oftentimes, when you start talking about the boundaries of parents and the boundaries of God, and when selfish desires come into play, well, first of all, we've got to deal with the concept that following after God and being obedient to God is all about denial of self. I mean, that's what the Bible teaches, that this concept of denying of self daily. And of course, the question rings then, why would I ever deny myself? Why would I deny myself? Why would I deny myself if my parents say be home at 10, but I want to be home at 10:30? Why would I deny myself?
All the way back to my point earlier about being raised in a society to fulfill what I want, what I need now. And so because of those thoughts and perceptions that people have, why would they deny themselves the lack of boundaries?
Why would they deny themselves the lack of boundaries?
I know. I went about that a really weird way, too.
I don't even know where to go with that.
In other words, you're playing games now.
You're playing games now.
I'm like, all right,
you
Joe.
Bad man.
I mean, but I think it kind of goes back to...
You're saying that if boundaries are good for me, why would I deny myself what's good for me?
Right, because you're saying, you're using these examples of people that are just kind of taking matters into their own hands. Well, might as well take the matter, release the boundary, get that out of my way because I have selfish desires. I want what I want when I want it. Which actually reminds me a little bit of your lesson this morning on waiting and not being impatient.
Well,
see, you thought I wasn't listening.
And that's another thing is that we think, especially young people think, I wasn't listening.
But you see what I did? I said listening, and then I did the eye thing, which is seeing.
You got to listen with your eyes, too.
I got to figure out my senses.
You got to listen with those eyes, too. I got listening ears, and I got listening eyes. That's exactly right. But you're right, and I talked about this morning that the enemy of waiting is impatience. And, of course, the question is, why would we be impatient? And the only answer I could say is because we truly believe that what we need right now and the fulfillment right now is better than what God's promised in the future. See, sometimes teenagers become impatient with the boundaries that their parents set, and they become impatient with the boundaries that God has set because it really is a situation of they believe that they have nothing better ahead of them or that these are the best days of their life. We're having tech issues again, aren't we?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm very distracted. Joe, you just keep on talking and teaching and just let me be over here figuring out what's going on. Just don't ask me questions. Because my mind is a million miles away right now.
But in all of that, I guess what I'm getting at is this. Sometimes we do not respect the parental boundaries and God's boundaries because we're short-sighted. In other words, it's this. God has told me how I'm supposed to act within a relationship with the opposite sex. I recognize that God has allowed a beautiful relationship in the future. Then why would I violate that? And oftentimes it's because we focus on the short term, not the long term. And of course, sometimes we could argue that would be a maturity thing. Sometimes we can argue that would be a spiritual minded thing. And it's not just in that area. Why is it that adults go outside of the boundaries of God? It's because they're focused on the immediate instead of the long term. And we forget that our life is but a vapor here. And whatever gratification that we may gain will be only but for a moment. And the reality is that the consequences of that last a lifetime. And so if I were talking to teenagers, if the question is how do we help teenagers have a respect for their parents' boundaries and for God's boundaries when selfish desires come in and when peer pressure, we haven't even dealt with peer pressure yet. But what I would say is this: God initiated boundaries and the concept of boundaries, not your parents. Number two, boundaries are there to keep you on the road so that you don't end up in the ditch. Number three, the reason that you're struggling with your selfish desires right now when it comes to boundaries is because you're focused on the short term instead of the long term. In other words, it's the concept of, if all I get wrapped up in is right here and now and I can't see past the end of my nose, then I'm never going to see the great blessing that God has in store for me in the future. And I'm not talking about in eternity. I'm talking about even here and now in this world, that as we mature and we do things God's ways, and we allow ourselves to be shaped by those boundaries, much like water is placed within an ice cube tray, and that water becomes formed to the tray and to the mold that it is in, that when we allow ourselves to be molded into what God would have us to be molded into.
When you allow yourself to be an ice cube.
Otherwise, all of a sudden, then you're more usable to God. You ever think about that? That water, when it's just
becoming an ice cube?
Well, that water, when it's spilled out all over the place, it's really good for nothing when it freezes. But water that is concentrated into a mold is useful to change the temperature of a drink.
So in other words, don't be good for nothing.
Don't be good for nothing. But the way you do that is obviously allow the boundaries to shape and mold you. And sometimes we don't do that, right?
Right.
And so what about the subject of peer pressure? She brings up peer pressure. I'm guessing for you never had the peer pressure to go outside the boundaries of your parents, or you never had the peer pressure to go outside of the boundaries your parents said or that God
now,
said.
Joe, let me just ask you a question. If I did, do you think I would admit it online?
I mean, no, because everything up to this point in time has been I never struggled with anything. That's
wait,
exactly right.
No. You took that all in the wrong
direction. Oh, was that
direction.
not what you said? I'm sorry.
I just said I didn't like to get in trouble, so I basically stayed out of trouble.
That's right.
End of story.
You know, what's interesting about peer pressure is when we cave, and when teenagers cave to peer pressure, I'm just going to keep going. When teenagers cave to peer pressure, it's because they're seeking the acceptance of other people. I mean, that's right.
This is true.
I mean, in high school, I had a guy that ate a worm for money.
You had a guy that ate a worm.
He was a friend. I mean, he really was. He was on our football team.
You knew a guy. You were there.
I was there and cheering him on the whole way. But the idea was that I was the negative peer pressure. That's exactly what I was. I was the negative peer pressure. But the idea was this, that why would anybody eat a worm? And of course, we paid him for it. And so maybe that peer pressure played into that.
That was even worse. You forced the poor guy.
So I was there for that. I've done a belly flop from the top deck of a pontoon boat down into a lake. Came up with a bloody nose. And the question would be, why would I do that? And of course, the only answer I could come up with is because the people wanted it, right?
And what the people want,
the people get. That's exactly right. My son, even Colton here in the wings, is even saying how he followed suit with that. So we get peer pressure, but you understand that the core peer pressure is seeking the acceptance and the approval of people. That's what it is. That's why we feel the pressure, because if I don't go in with it... Should I look
up the dictionary definition to make sure? No. You're right. You're right.
But if I don't,
love dictionary definitions.
If I don't go with it, then all of a sudden I am, I risk the consequences. I don't even know how else to say that of not going along with it. And for some young people, that's not a big deal. You know, some people it's like peer pressure, not a big deal. I'll go away. But for other people, peer pressure can drive you. Now, here's what's funny. We as parents know that peer pressure is powerful, because we will use phrases like positive peer pressure and negative peer pressure, right? And we want our children to have positive peer pressure.
If everybody jumps off the bridge, would you?
Which is negative. But the idea was this. Why do we want our children to hang around other Christian teenagers? It's because our hope and desire is that as they are spiritually minded, that it will impact our young people to be spiritually minded. And as our young people are spiritually minded, it will impact them to be spiritually minded. So we understand the power of peer pressure as parents. Right? We need to not play that down, that we don't understand the power of peer pressure. But the question is, how do we help young people dealing with peer pressure still respect the boundaries of their parents and the boundaries of God? And the only way I can say it is this. As we raise our young people and as they grow into teenhood and they grow into adulthood, that we've got to raise them to understand that there are priorities that are set. And the acceptance of your peers is not the highest priority in your life. That's going to be tough, because especially young people are insecure. They want to be included. At the lunchroom table, they want people to want to sit with them. When it comes to social media, they don't want to be the only one that's left out. You name it. I mean, for those of you who are parents, it would be the equivalent of you're the last person in gym class and you're dividing up into teams, and it becomes between you and the dog that showed up, and somebody picks the dog, right?
Dog.
It's the idea nobody wants to be the one that lost to the dog. So we understand that, right? But the truth is this, even if I had...
The dog's throwing me off.
It was a cute dog. even if I had to stand on my own, and as long as I stood on the side of God, I've got to be willing for me to say, even if nobody else stands with me, I've got to go along with God. And that's hard. If we're just going to be real, that is very, very difficult. It's not just difficult for teens. It's difficult for adults.
It sure is.
Because that means it'll cost you. In the world of adulthood, it could cost you relationships. It could cost you business promotions. It could cost you your job in general. All these things are costly when you decide to stand on God's side instead of worrying about whether or not you're going to stand on the side of men. But here's what I do know, and Matthew teaches this in Matthew chapter 6, that there's a reward that man gives and there's a reward that God gives. For those who seek the reward of God, the magnitude of that reward and the value of that reward is so far greater than whatever man could give you. And so when it comes to the boundaries of parents and the boundaries of God, number one, we need to understand they're there for our benefit, that God's the originator of those. We need to understand that selfish desires are a root cause of why an individual would go against those boundaries, because they focus on the temporary instead of the eternal. And the idea is this, that when you stand with God, even if it costs you everything else, that the reward that you will gain is so greater, so far greater, much greater than whatever man would give you. Now, whether or not that's easy, I mean, that's not talking about sexual concepts, as Vicki pointed out. It's just the idea of understanding authority. It's understanding why that authority is there in the first place. And for young people, it's hard because, they don't necessarily think through everything. They just think about how restricted their life is. But I want you to understand something. It was God's desire and God's will and God's plan for children to be born from adults. I mean, that's what it was. That's his plan. You go back to the Bible and it was this: man, woman, you're going to have children. And then you're going to raise those children. And then they had the spiritual responsibility to make sure, in the Old Testament especially, to make sure that spiritual information was passed down from generation to generation to generation. Now, I believe that was never undone for the New Testament. And we have teaching in Ephesians regarding the idea of raising a child and how that was supposed to happen. Other passages in the New Testament that talk about the importance of teaching our children and not becoming a stumbling block to our children. And so there's a responsibility that parents have that they'll give an account before God with. And so if boundaries aren't inherently bad and God used boundaries to help his people, we've got to understand parents use boundaries to help their children. Teenagers need to know those boundaries are going to be consistent. And that's probably where we fail as parents. It's not that we don't like setting boundaries. I mean, all of us like, hey, get the dishes done. Hey, take out the trash. Hey, clean your room. And then we may say something like this: if you don't do it, then you're going to be grounded for a certain amount of time. And then the child doesn't do it and the punishment never comes about. And what happens is, in the eyes of the child, they said, well, those boundaries weren't real boundaries. And so therefore they live in shaky ground and it will play into their development. So from parents' standpoint, we've got to be more consistent.
Shaky ground, so the guardrails have sank.
The guardrails have become not planted. And so when the car hits the guardrail just folds. And you know what happens when a guardrail folds? The car ends up in the ditch. Mm-hmm. But what happens when the guardrail stands firm? The car gets beat up, but most times it stays on the safe side of the danger. So parents, we've got to be more consistent. But to help young people, I would say this: don't focus on the temporary, focus on the eternal, and realize this, that even if you have to stand on your own with God, that the reward that he offers you is so much greater. Now, is any of this easy? No, it's not easy. Parenting it's difficult because you've got to be on your game. You got to be consistent. And sometimes you don't want to be consistent because you're tired or you're run down. But the reality is this: you owe it to your kids to be consistent. You owe it to your kids to teach the boundaries of God, because God is consistent when it comes to his boundaries. Now, from a kid's standpoint, it gets tough because you really start asking questions such as, am I strong enough? Is this a strong enough person to withstand whatever attacks, be it internal or external, that compel them to go against the boundaries?
You've been teasing me about, saying I'm perfect, which I did not. But that is one thing I struggle with, being tired. I want to be consistent, but it's easy to get tired.
It's very easy to get tired, and I've been there more times than I would like to admit, but the reality is we got to do that for our kids. And any parent who would listen to this, I would say you need to do that for your kids as well. So Did we have any comments that came in as the show was going, other than technology is awful and you're choppy?
And I've not gotten anything recently, so okay. I'm not sure if it's me or if it's me.
Okay. Well, either way, you may listen to this and watch this.
And if you made it through, we applaud you.
That's right. And you may, over time, you may watch this over the next few days. And, of course, it'll stay up at our Facebook site. And I want to encourage you to leave a comment below, because we do read the comments that come in throughout the week.
Other people read them. That watch this later on, they like to see the comments.
And so the conversation continues, I guess is what's saying. Just because the show's done being recorded live doesn't mean the show doesn't continue as far as discussion. And so if you have any ideas as to how to help young people in regards to respecting parental boundaries and God's boundaries and the authority of God, other than the things we mentioned, of course, we're limited on time to mention only what we can and discuss what we can.
Yes, you're already over time, Joe.
So I would say this. Leave a comment below. We would love to talk to you about it, and maybe you would bring something to the table that would be a true blessing to a parent going through this. And I would say this, from a teenager standpoint, if you're watching this or you'll listen to this later on, come back and leave a message, because there may be some insight there that you offer that will help either the parents that read this or will help another teenager who is struggling with some of the same things you are and saying, hey, I want to respect my parents' authority and boundaries, and I want to respect God's authority and boundaries, but it does make me feel like I'm on an island all by myself. Maybe this is the show and the episode where you gain security and you gain strength, much like Elijah, who was hiding from Jezebel, where you realize you're not the only one, and that other people also are going through that. And it may cost you with certain peers, but I will tell you this, it will always be worth what it'll cost you if you seek the reward that God has in store for you. So that's my final thought, I guess, on the show. Aaron, do you have any final thoughts?
I don't. I never have final thoughts. My brain just keeps going and going and going.
Now, I believe that. You think in commas, not periods. Oh, no, it says it was you speak in commas and not periods. So, all right, we want to thank you for tuning in tonight to the Hey Joe Show.
We are going to keep plugging away at these tech issues.
Yeah, and we hope that the new camera is something that you enjoy. And, of course, Colton is having a ball being the production manager. He did a great job. I would say let's give him a round of applause, but it would just be his mom and I doing that. And I'm not sure. Never mind. He's applauding himself in the background. So, but anyhow, we thank you for tuning in. Obviously, we thank you again, the lightnetwork.tv. If you haven't gone over there, go over there, check it out.
Download this episode this coming Thursday.
Download the Hey Joe Show. Go to the Apple Podcast app on your phone or on your iPod or on your iPad, and make sure you subscribe to the Hey Joe Show. Go to your Android device. Make sure you subscribe there. And obviously, we want to make sure that this gets out to as many people as possible. Now, I have to say this. I brought it up, I think it was a couple weeks ago when we were on the show live. And I'll just say this as we close off.
More attention to it next.
More attention next week. But I'm going to say something. It's the Hey Joe Show. That means I can take 10 seconds, right? Unless she cuts me off as the manager of the show now. But the very first issue of iLuminate is in the final stages. It actually comes out in a week and a half, I believe is what it is, around the 1st of March. And so it's going to be free. You download the app. You can get it on your devices. And what's going to be cool about it is it's going to be fresh. It's going to be smoking hot. Great graphic designer working on it. Wonderful grammar editor. We put together a good team.
Lots of awesome authors.
The authors were awesome. Got an interview with a retired Major League Baseball player that's going to be in it. And so I'm excited about it. Be looking for it. And we will definitely make more of a deal and a push next week. So that's all I have. Check us out on Facebook if you haven't already done so. And I guess we're out.
Please hang up and try again.
Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Psalm 90, verse 2. For more inspiring thoughts, visit kopublications.org.
There's an old Italian proverb which says, "Who at 20 knows nothing, at 30 does nothing, at 40 has nothing." That proverb points out the need for beginning early in life to apply ourselves to the things that will equip us to live a successful life. There's an area in which this advice is most critical, and that is in the spiritual realm. The wise man of old advised, "Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, before the evil days come and the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them." The time to begin serving God in Christ is at the earliest age of accountability. What a wonderful thing to live a full life of service to God and to look back upon it with satisfaction and joy in old age. I'm Jim Dearman with a brief message of truth for the world. Much is written by nutritionists about the needs of young people. Educators write about what young people should learn. Psychologists delve into the problems young people have in group association. And all this is good. For Jesus, our example, increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. But I'll leave the physical needs of young people to the nutritionist, the intellectual needs to the educator, and the social needs to the psychologist. But young people have a fourth need, the spiritual. Young people need Jesus Christ. Often we adults concentrate on the physical and social needs of our children and neglect their spiritual needs. Young people need God. Young people need spiritual guidance. Young people need association with others their age who have wholesome goals and ideas. Young people need the Bible. I'm Jim Dearman with a brief message of what is humility. These lines about humility were written by Glenn Baird, a man who lived a lifetime of suffering with a serious illness and death ever at his doorstep. He wrote, "Humility is a life of service with no thought of reward. It is giving praise to others with a kind, thoughtful word. It means being meek, kind, and gentle, with a good deed here and there. It is never mean or haughty, but often follows prayer. It means being full of compassion for a fellow human being. If you have grace to be humble, happy days you'll be seeing." In God's Word, we find courage and joy in trials, and we find the means for achieving true humility. I'm Jim Dearman with a brief message. We read every day of people who are dying by the hundreds and thousands because they don't have the basic necessities of life. We may have seen the picture of a starving mother holding the thin, lifeless body of her dying child, a child she cannot save because there's no food. We may weep with compassion because her hope is gone. But do we weep with compassion over the thousands of souls who are dying every day without God and without hope for a better life to come? 1 John 3:17 tells us, "But whoso hath this world's goods, and seeth his brother have need, and shutteth up his bowels of compassion from him, how dwelleth the love of God in him?" If we have the love of God within us, we must be merciful, compassionate, and unselfish. If we love God, we must go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, realizing that he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. I'm Jim Dearman. A poet once wrote, "I shouted aloud and louder while out on the plain one day. The sound grew faint and fainter until it had died away. My words had gone forever. They left no trace or track. But the hills nearby caught up the cry and sent an echo back. I spoke a word in anger to one who was my friend. Like a knife it cut him deeply, a wound that was hard to mend. That word so thoughtlessly uttered, I would we could both forget, but its echo lives and memory gives the recollections yet. How many hearts are broken, how many friends are lost by some unkind word spoken before we count the cost. But a word or deed of kindness will repay 100-fold, for it echoes again in the hearts of men and carries a joy untold. I'm Jim Dearman with a brief message of truth for the world.
Speaking of the program is Jim Dearman.
Love makes obedience a thing of joy. To do the will of one we like to please is never hardship, though it tax our strength. Each privilege of service love will seize. Love makes us loyal, glad to do or go, and eager to defend a name or cause. Love takes the drudgery from common work and asks no rich reward or great applause. Love gives us satisfaction in our task and wealth in learning lessons of the heart. Love sheds a light of glory on our toil and makes us humbly glad to have a part. Love makes us choose to do the will of God, to run His errands and proclaim His truth. It gives our hearts an eager, lilting song. Our feet are shod with tireless wings of youth.
You know, enthusiasm is a great thing. I believe that God's people ought to be enthusiastic. David said in the Old Testament, "Zeal for thy house hath consumed me." I have learned in life that God will often strike a match to light a torch, and He does. Someone said years ago in a song that it only takes a spark to get a fire going. You know, we ought to be a people that burn with the fires of enthusiasm and zeal. It would amaze you and amaze me what we could do in this world if we could just light that fire for God and be that kind of person that the Lord has asked us to be. A big fire starts from a little match, and it really, really does. And you and I ought to be that catalyst that gets that big fire for God going. Many times in life, because of a lot of things, we lose our zest and our zeal and our enthusiasm for God. But that's something that ought to grow every day with you and with me. And I hope this morning, if you've lost the spring in your step and you've lost the song in your heart, then I hope you would turn to God and let Him rekindle that fire once again that burned deep within your soul. Many of you, no doubt, this morning well remember when you became a child of God and a Christian, and how thrilled you were at that moment, and when they sang that invitation song and you walked down that aisle and gave your hand to the preacher and your heart to God, how excited and how thrilled you were about the forgiveness that God was bringing into your life. I hope this morning that you can experience that once again. It is still there, and my friend, you will find it where you left it. Go back to God. If you're not going to worship, go back to God. Go back to the church, to the people that love you. And you will find that the fire can burn once again. And my friend, it's something to think about.
Sometimes at the death of a pet, children will ask, "Is my dog going to go to heaven?" Adults argue over whether or not animals have souls. The question really is, what does the Bible say? In the Bible, the word soul is sometimes used of animals in the sense of the physical life force found within all living creatures. But the word soul, in the sense of an immortal soul that will one day inhabit heaven or hell, is never used with reference to an animal. Man is unique in this sense. Only man is said to be created in the image of God. Only man is referred to as a son of God. No animal is ever referred to as an offspring of God. And only of man does the Bible say the spirit will return to God who gave it. Ecclesiastes 12:7. I'm Don Blackwell with 60 seconds about the second coming. And remember, the Lord may come again at any second.
Let's pause and consider marriage as we find described in the Word of God. You see, God designed it. God has defined it. He tells us what He wants it to be. Recently, my wife and I passed the 50th anniversary milestone, if you want to call it that. Quite a celebration, thanks to our 3 girls. It was amazing day when many of our friends expressed their love. And it's that which we hold and treasure in our hearts, even to this very moment, and will the rest of our lives. But those things are really not important. What's important is that LaDon and I fashion our lives according to this book. It's not always been easy. It's not always been peaceful. We're human. I've made mistakes. I've made mistakes that have brought agony and tears at times. And I haven't been perfect, never have been, never will be. But there's one thing that I can say, and the Bible speaks about it, how that we should be faithful. We should keep our vows. That I've tried to do. And husbands and wives should always try to do that. Isn't it a tragedy today that approximately 1 in 2 marriages, one of them is going to end in divorce, in misery and tragedy? The children suffer significantly as a result. When we say, "Till death we do part," let's mean it. God wants husband and wife, man and woman, that's what God's marriage is a man and a woman married to each other, bringing up children, having that spiritual home, till death they do part. Let's pause and consider this serious concern.
If you were to ask many young people to list the top scorers in basketball or to write down the words of the most popular songs on the radio, the majority of them could do that with no problem. They remember these things because they spend most of their time watching TV or listening to music. But what would be the reaction of many of these same young people if you were asked them to quote a verse from the Bible? Some would probably think you were crazy for asking such a question. What is more important for these young people to know, basketball statistics and music lyrics, or Bible verses by which they will be judged at the end of time? 2 Timothy 3:15 reads, "And that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith, which is in Christ Jesus." Let's be sure we're training our children in the Word, not in the world. I'm Jim Dearman with a brief message of truth for the world.
I'm Caleb Colley, and we're on the Rock. A recent ESPN mini-documentary concerns the legendary Herschel Walker trade in NFL football. In October 1989, the Dallas Cowboys traded former Georgia star Herschel Walker, one of the best ever running backs, to the Minnesota Vikings for 5 mediocre players. Nobody could understand why the Cowboys made the trade. The Cowboys' new coach, Jimmy Johnson, was in his first year as coach of a professional team, and the Vikings assumed that they were pulling the wool over his eyes. Johnson knew that the fine print of the trade stated that for each of the 5 former Vikings players that the Cowboys cut from their roster, they would receive one of the Vikings' future draft picks. These picks would eventually produce the players that built an early 90s Cowboys dynasty that included 3 Super Bowl championships. But when Johnson announced the trade in 1989, he was not about to tell the world all of the trade's details, or that he planned to cut the 5 players and thereby rob the Vikings of future draft picks. The media accused Cowboys leadership of getting robbed. After all, in addition to giving up Walker, the team even had to pay him a huge bonus to keep him from retiring, just so the trade could go through. It was considered to be the great trade robbery. One reporter said, "Now you can totally bury the thing. The season's gone, and you have to wonder when football will be back in Dallas." The Cowboys knew the facts, and staying the course, despite heavy criticism, reaped great rewards. They dealt the Vikings picks throughout 5 years of drafts and built a juggernaut. Similarly, Christians must recognize that the world will not understand our priorities or why we would give up earthly benefits for heavenly benefits. The world's confusion on this point shouldn't surprise us because Christians know spiritual truths of which the world is willingly ignorant. And this makes all the difference. The world couldn't understand Moses' choice to suffer with the Israelites rather than to enjoy the luxurious lifestyle in Egypt. The world couldn't understand why Daniel's 3 friends would go to the fiery furnace rather than to commit idolatry. The world couldn't understand John the Baptist's conviction about the sanctity of marriage, a conviction that led to his execution. The world couldn't understand why the early Christian martyrs, such as Polycarp, would not renounce Christ, even though their faithfulness meant their death. The fact of the matter is that God's people understand things that people of the world simply do not. Like Moses, Christians see him who is invisible. That is, based on sufficient evidence. We are convicted about the existence of God, the lordship of Christ, and the inspiration of the Bible. And we're not willing to compromise the many convictions that are based upon these realities. But the world doesn't see the invisible. And so often, they won't take Christianity seriously. But this must not deter us from faithfulness. As Jesus said in John chapter 15, verses 18 to 21, "If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of this world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me," Jesus said, "they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours. But all these things they will do to you on account of my name, because they do not know him who sent me." Join us next time on The Rock.
Have you ever heard the expression two-faced, or talking out of both sides of one's mouth? Well, those are expressions which depict that a certain person is not what he really claims to be. He's saying one thing, doing another. None of us really trusts or cares for such a person, yet in the religious sense, many people are really living this way. That is, they're professing to be religious, while their lives do not reflect what they profess. James wrote about a double-minded man in James 1:8 and said such a man is unstable in all his ways. God does not want instability. He wants strength and faith that does not waver. He wants dedication to truth, not tradition. And he wants lives that reflect love for God and for all men. True Christianity will bless your life and the life of all those around you through your influence. I'm Jim Dearman with a brief message of truth for the world. How often have we heard children say such things as, "You hurt my feelings," or "I don't like you, I don't want to play with you," or "Go away and leave me alone"? And children are very good about expressing their displeasure, but they're quick to forgive, forget, and go on as if nothing ever happened. Have you ever heard or seen these same feelings expressed by adults? Children do not let petty grievances stand in the way of reconciliation, but adults may often be so sensitive that long-time associations and friendships may be severed by the slip of a tongue. Many times, rather than forgiving and forgetting as children do, these adults grow bitter, resentful, and unfriendly. It's been said it is true that we're only young once, but we can remain immature indefinitely. Paul wrote, "Be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you." I'm Jim Dearman with a brief message.
You're listening to The Hey Joe Show Radio, brought to you by the Light Network. To learn more about The Hey Joe Show, visit thelightnetwork.tv.
Encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
YouTube TV. Now, live. Channel 2 Action News at 5 a.m. Watch now on WSB2.
We are back in our...
Thank you for listening to The Hey Joe Show Radio, brought to you by the Light Network and powered by Truth.fm. To learn more about Hey Joe Show Radio, visit kopublications.org.
Encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
Hello and welcome to the Hey Joe Show. We're glad that you joined us tonight.
Yes, very glad. Are you having issues over there to start with?
Well, you know what?
Hey, there's an issue.
Issues.
There is a spider on your microphone.
What?
Oh,
Did I get it?
I hope it wasn't.
Boom, there it is. It's
I don't
dead.
think you got it.
I did. I just killed it, smushed it with my hand.
What does that mean? What does that mean if there's
That
a
means
spider to...
our studio needs an exterminator is what that means.
Okay.
I guess. I don't know what else that means. Let's say it needs an exterminator,
Yeah,
right?
there you go.
Let's say it needs an exterminator. But we're glad that you're with us tonight.
Yes,
and we
are.
welcome you here on this Sunday night. Those of you who are joining us live over Facebook, we thank you for tuning in. And those, of course, who will be listening to this later in the week with the lightnetwork.tv or through Apple Podcast, we want to thank you for tuning in as well. And, of course, as always, we want to give a shout out to the lightnetwork.tv. And
Shout out to the Light Network.
Thank them for allowing us the opportunity to be on their show.
Why don't you laugh at my, or act like
I'll
I'm
be real
cool.
with you, because you're bringing a level of energy to the table that I just don't have.
Joe has no energy. He's tired.
I don't have that level of energy tonight. And part of that's because we had a great weekend. This was a weekend that we did a fundraiser for a children's home in the area. And, of course, not we in the sense of you and I, but in the sense of the congregation. And, of course, yesterday was a lot of time spent out in the sun and a lot of carrying of washing machines and furniture because we had a live auction, which was pretty cool. Have you ever been a part of a live auction?
I have never been a part of a live auction.
I haven't either, but I have concluded a couple things.
You were yesterday.
Well, yesterday, that's correct. Not before, though. But I've concluded something, and that is this. I would not be a good auctioneer. I just wouldn't. I have the ability to talk and the ability to gab. You know, sometimes people have the ability of gab, the gift of gab, right?
I have no idea. I know nothing about that.
But what I do not have is the gift of, can I get a 50 cents, 25 cents?
What do you mean? When you talk, that's all I ever hear.
I know. I'm afraid you do. Sometimes I'm afraid that's all people hear anyhow. And they're like, oh, you're preaching. Oh, I guess. I don't know. But it was cool. But I recognize that I would never be a good auctioneer. But that's why I'm tired. And obviously I had the privilege today of preaching God's word twice, teaching a Bible class, and I'm just tired. So anyway, you're bringing a level of energy to the table.
Atlanta, 5 a.m.
I'm not
Watch now on Fox 5.
Well, I have a few things to say to that, but I will keep them to myself.
Oh, man. Okay.
I know, I'm going to be good.
Speechless? Wow, giving you the opportunity, and you still pass it up. So anyhow.
Oh, is that what you're doing? You're saying I'm speechless.
Well, you were speechless, but either way. But we obviously didn't come here tonight to have a show dealing with whether or not I'm tired or not.
Spiders and Joe being tired and
spiders
auctioneers.
And all that good stuff. So, but we've got a good show for you tonight. And, of course, this season of the Hey Joe Show, we are dealing with issues that you, the listeners, have proposed to us.
Yes,
and have thrown our way. And so sometimes you look at those and you go, oh, we know where we're wanting to go and whatnot, and it makes it easy. And then other times
we just drive there.
And we just go. But the other times it's like, oh, this is what you want to hear. And so that then causes us to either draw off of some of the things that we've studied in the past or even some of our own experiences. That dude.
The things we know.
That's alive.
We do need an exterminator up here. This is embarrassing, Joe.
Need an exterminator.
I'm never going to be able to show my face again.
Don't zone in on our ladybug thing here, okay?
It's an Asian beetle.
Yeah, it's an Asian beetle right here on the desk. And, of course, I don't think the camera can get to it, which is a great thing. But either way, tonight's show is not about Asian beetles. It's not about spiders. It's not about my lack of energy. And it's not about Aaron's massive energy, right? I don't even know how else to say that.
So massive.
So here's the deal. On the episode where we took listener requests, right? Their feedback.
Right.
There were two that sort of went in together. Okay. And they went in together in the sense of they covered basically the same issue, but did so kind of in a little different way. And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to couple these two topics together so that we can, I guess you could say we can handle them both at the same time and do the best that we can. And of course, it may merit a second show. I'm not sure, because tonight's subject is dealing with the concept of understanding the sexual identity crisis in America. And of course, one of the listeners who recommended this and requested this came to Polishing the Pulpit, which is a wonderful event that we get to go to every year. And I delivered I delivered a lesson at Polishing the Pulpit on this particular subject. And there was somebody else who requested something dealing with the LGBT agenda and how that's impacting young people and the confusion that exists amongst young people. And so that's the direction that we're going to take with the show tonight. And of course, we would love to have viewer feedback. And so if there are questions that come about, if there are comments that come about, look here below the video on Facebook. You can type your question. Of course, Aaron is monitoring that and will reply to that.
And it's working this week. Whoop,
Very good. And so that's where we want to go. So I guess to start off, sometimes when we think about the sexual identity crisis in America and we think about the impact that it's having on teenagers and how do teenagers kind of navigate that, sometimes we may not understand even what we're saying. I hate to say it that way, because when we talk about the sexual identity, we live in some interesting times, Aaron. And of course, you and I have talked about this, and the impact that this has on working with young people and working with families is that we live in an interesting time of things aren't as, I guess you could say, clear cut as they once were in this subject matter in America. There was a time period in America where there was a sense of male and female were pretty much accepted concepts. And on the whole, I'm speaking as a whole here. But then it was an idea of, okay, we understand homosexuality, sodomy, and of course those people who are listening to this, you've heard the word homosexual long enough to know that you understand that is male and male in a romantic relationship, which I guess they would call it romantic. I don't know. I don't want to go there and add, descriptions, but the idea also then of female to female, right? And so the idea was either you were a heterosexual or you were a homosexual. That was the sexual discussion that was in America for so long, right? But in our society today, to simply boil it down to someone being a heterosexual or a homosexual is really not to capture the massive aspect of this discussion, because there are so many different concepts now that seem to be at the forefront that, at least in my studies, as I did research back through the time period of the Stonewall Inn, where some people would say that the homosexual movement really began to pick up steam. And of course, those of you who don't know that, it was a club, a gathering of those individuals who were homosexuals, and the police that would come in because of, at that time period in America, not just the social taboos, but even at times the legality of it was brought into question. And so there was what they would say was persecution on their part. And of course, it really started or continued and really ramped up a movement. So, but in our culture, it's beyond that now. You think back in April of 2016, there was a particular chain of stores that made a massive announcement, and that was this. They allowed individuals who were male but identified as female to begin to use the female restroom. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do know what you're talking about.
I don't want to say said name, said retail store. I don't think I have to.
I don't think you have to either.
But you see, it wasn't a matter of then whether or not an individual was a heterosexual or homosexual. It was, what did you identify with? Did you identify with a man? Were you born a male but identified as a female? And if that's the case, then you see yourself as a female. You feel that you are a female, trapped in a male body. Then as long as you go with what you feel and how you identify with, then you can use whatever restroom that you want. And of course, that was a major uproar, and individuals stopped going to the store. For a while, right? Well, I think that was a major deal. Of course, that wasn't the only major deal that ever occurred on this particular subject, because in 2015, Glamour magazine announced as Woman of the Year an individual with the last name Jenner. Now, I'm going to call him Bruce because I struggle recognizing the other aspect of what's going on here. But it was interesting because in that particular magazine, this individual is quoted as saying this: "I never in a million years thought that I would be here." Now, mind you, Bruce Jenner, a male, was an Olympic athlete who decided that he needed to have a change, a gender change, an identity change. And of course, he, at that particular time, I'm not going to go into so many details as to what extent he has gone through in that effort. But we all know that now he wants to be known as Caitlyn Jenner, right? Well, this particular time in 2015, he's 66 years old. And when he's accepting the award for Glamour magazine Woman of the Year, he said, "For years and years, I've never felt like I fit in anywhere. I always felt as an outsider. I never felt good in the male side, and I wasn't obviously in the female side. I was kind of stuck in the middle." Now, that may sound like a weird concept for us as we start talking about this and address this issue, but that really gets more to the core of what's going on in this concept. And if we're going to be able to have an educational discussion with our teenagers and with our children, if this becomes something that they are exposed to in the sense of education or in the sense of children in their school settings, maybe that would all of a sudden start identifying as such and start acting as such and behaving as such, then we need to know kind of some of the description ideas behind that. Now, there's not a new concept to us, though. Some people don't realize that there was an individual back in the 1950s, I believe it was, who was an ex-GI, an ex-government, I forget what GI stands for at the top of my head. It was in the military during World War II.
There you go.
Okay. But anyhow, he decided that he no longer wanted to be a male. He wanted to be a female. Now, that was that long ago. And so there was this idea of beginning to dress like and to have this idea of behaving as a woman, right? But actually, we would go on to become a movie star as such and a performer, actually. There was also individuals back in Native American time periods that were called two-spirited people. And those were males who dressed as females. And so it's not exactly like this is a modern day invention in America. But it is something that has picked up steam in America, right?
It
and so
absolutely has.
It's become definitely more prominent. And so if we're going to have an understanding of this and help our young people, then we've got to know what we're talking about, right? All right. So when I say the word gender, obviously the default is male or female, right?
Right.
Male or female. Now, the word gender actually...
Default.
Right. Well, because you were born either as a male or as a female, right?
Absolutely.
And so, therefore, that's what the word gender means. It refers to the psychological, social, and cultural aspect of being male or female. So, in other words, the dictionary definition or the psychological definition actually talks about the cultural expectations with that and whether or not an individual falls in line with those cultural expectations. But then there's another word that is gender identity. And gender identity refers to how a person experiences him or herself or thinks of her or himself. So the idea behind that is this: I may be born with a gender. No, maybe I am born with a gender, but I may identify with a different gender. Now, some individuals will identify with their genders. So a male will identify as a male and a female will identify as a female. But the gender identity concept, which ultimately plays into at times the sexual identity idea, is what happens if I don't identify with the gender that I was born into?
Well, and really what does identify mean? What does that even encompass?
It means you accept and you, I don't know if play out is the correct terminology, but you accept the men do this and the women do that. Some would say it's the cultural expectation. Some would say it is the norm for that gender. And some of that goes into gender roles, right? Which is where sometimes people come into conflict with where they identify gender-wise. And that's why the idea of gender role refers to ways in which people adopt cultural expectations for maleness or femaleness. And so what happens if I'm taught all my life, men do this, men do this, men do this, but I don't identify with that, therefore I do not identify with the male gender. I'm born a male, but I identify with a female cultural role expectation. Now, here's where that comes into play, and there's all kinds of reasons. What about a young boy who is raised in a female-only family? In other words, the male in his life was never a part of his life. He's raised by women. Some would say, and I would think for good measure, that he may actually identify more with women. Well, our culture today, and this is where the danger comes into play, is because we have an agenda, a movement with an agenda that wants to impress upon, especially our young people, that if that is what you are in your cultural environment that you're growing up in, then if you feel like you identify more with females because females have been a part of your life, maybe you were raised by your mother, your grandmother, an aunt, you spent most of your time around females, then all of a sudden this agenda movement is going to push and impress upon you. Well, then that is what your identity is. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense.
Now, you notice how I said that. It's an agenda-driven concept. It's not appeal to your maleness. It is, don't fight what you are identifying with. And so that's why our society has really started to ramp up towards this, because now there's this massive movement of, well, if you identify as a female, but you suppress that because you were born a male, then you're not being, quote unquote, true to yourself. And so there's a big push to don't push that away, be true to yourself. Even the subject of bullying comes about in that. If a woman is born obviously a female, but she identifies as a more masculine individual, then some people would say that it would be bullying to try to get her to see that she was a female and to identify as a female.
So don't be true to the facts.
Well, you have to overlook the facts. That's what it is. You overlook the facts in order to come to the conclusion of this agenda. I don't know how else to say that.
Yes, and just as a little side note, GI is abbreviation for government issue. So now we know. Now you know. And that's important. We had a couple people that
I'm just impressed we got a couple people listening live.
Well, one of them's my dad.
Oh, well, good. Never mind. We gotta pay him, I guess, to continue to listen. But anyhow, and so that's really where we're going, is learning to understand the terms and the discussion. So in today's society, it's not so much homosexual versus heterosexual, at least not in the terminology that is used. Terminology that is used today is transgender,
terminology,
third gender, gender bending, transsexual, cross-dressing, gender fluid. And some of these are concepts that when you look at them, you would say, oh, I can't believe that that's even a part of this picture. Well, it is, because what you have are individuals who do not identify with what they were born as gender-wise. And so it creates this idea of what's called gender dysphoria, which is when an individual refers it refers to an experience of gender identity in which a person's psychological and emotional sense of themselves as a female, for instance, does not match or align with their birth sex as a male. And so that's what this gender dysphoria in this world of individuals coming up with descriptions will call this. It's that lostness between, when you do not identify as what your biological sex is. And so that's where transgenderism comes into play, which is really an umbrella term where people express their gender identities differently than those of their biological sex. Third gender is a term used to describe persons who identify as neither male nor female. Can you imagine that? I saw the other day on a news channel I was watching that this idea of no longer calling individuals he or she is being put forth. And so therefore there's all kinds of other descriptions, such as Z. I mean, Z was one of those, Z-E. You don't call him a he, you don't call her a she, you call them a Z.
You can't even do it.
I don't even know how to say it.
You cannot even make it work.
I mean, it's just weird but that's because in our culture today, if you see a male and call him a he, then you are judging him that because he's born male, that he must identify with maleness. And if a woman you call a she, you are judging and putting into a box that she must identify as a she. And so now if I call
just terrible.
Him or her.
Terrible.
Well, the idea is this. I know it's kind of technical, but we're talking about how do you help teenagers today in this environment, and how do you come to understand the agenda that's behind it, right? And that's what this is all about. Do you have any comments from the listeners?
Hang on just a second. Well, other than having to give you the correct term for GI, we have a lot of hellos. And
oh, well, good. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.
Lunacy. That was a comment.
Lunacy. Well, somebody would take offense to that if they're listening to this otherwise. But you know what? I'm not going to. I agree with you, because at the end of the day, what you have is, I fully believe when the culture becomes such that evil is called good and good is called evil, then your morals are turned upside down. And that to me is not thinking straight. Lunacy, that would be that concept, because it defies logic. And so as I try to talk about things and think about things from a logical perspective, we've got to come to understand something, that oftentimes this issue of sexual identity and the agenda of the LGBTQ movement is not based upon logic.
Well, and that's what I was going to say. I mean, that's actually something I've been really thinking about lately. I went to I guess you'd say a conference this weekend, and logic was brought up. And that's something that I've even spent some time this weekend thinking about. A lot of times in today's society and culture, people are not thinking logically. Now, if you told them that, I doubt that they'd say, oh yeah, no, I'm not thinking logically. Of course, they're going to think that their way is, I hate to keep using that word logically over again for sake of repeating it over and over. But a lot of times I think people think that they're thinking in a way that makes sense. But really, we're not training, and I say we as a society as a whole, we aren't training this generation of people coming up to think in a way that, in fact, is truly using